Good evening, dear colleagues, dear visitors and participants of the conference. It is a pleasure for me to open this round table about the topic of the birth of the New World and urban experiences in Eastern Europe after 1917. With this round table, we are concluding the 2 days of the fruitful and I would dare say successful conference that we started last morning, which is the multiplicity of exits of the war, the urban experiences of Eastern Europe in 1917-1923. Actually, any event has a history behind it. We as historians are well aware of the fact, of course. This event also has the history behind it. I believe it was predetermined by the coming out of the very important book published back in 1997. It was the first edition, and the title was The Capitals in War, Paris, London, Berlin in 1914-1919. And it was the social history, but in 2007 there was a second volume published. It was the cultural history already. The book and the two collection of essays, they showed the fruitful research work of the very complicated period of war through the prism of urban experiences in the comparative aspect. The two books were published in particular, and due to the person sitting next to me on my right, this is Professor J. Winter from Yale University, who was the editor of the two volumes back then. And Professor Winter is one of the pioneers of the First World War studies, who illustrated in his works how the First World War could be explored and how the memory on the First World War could be studied, how different practices of this war could be researched, the commemorative practices in particular. In his works, he is trying to show how the practices were developing, how the people were learning to cherish this history of grievance, history of emotions, the history of visiting the monuments, and this is also the history which is typical for the fiction and for the filmmaking, etc. This is the huge scope of materials and information available in the books. Of course, I encourage you to read these books. Unfortunately, none of them have been translated into the Ukrainian language so far. We are promoting our research, of course, and yesterday, last night, Professor Winter had a very powerful and interesting concept about the Second Great War of 1917-1923. And it's the Second Great War in English, I have to say it, because we might not be identifying it, because this First Great War and the Second Great War, because we usually say the Second World War and there's some sort of confusion about that, but we need to be specific about the terminology. And I believe many of you were present at the lecture last night and you understood the concept of Professor Winter. In addition to Professor Winter, we also have many other prominent researchers of the First World War. And tonight, during this discussion, we shall have Professor Serhy Yekelchyk, that you know very well, his works, you know them very well. His research, his studies are also very deep insights and very good intellectual writings about the history of Ukraine in the 20th century. What is most important, the publications by Professor Yekelchyk, who works at the Victoria University in Canada. They are published in English and in Ukrainian language as well. And it's very good to have this legacy. You know, very often Ukrainian history is represented for the foreign readers in a very simplified manner and format, and vice versa. But these books are so powerful and really informative. I'm sure all of you read The History of Ukraine, The Birth of the Modern Nation, that came out in 2011. It was translated into 5 languages. And the Empire of Memory, the Russian-Ukrainian relations in the Soviet historical perception. This is the bestseller among the students. It sells like hotcakes, and not only in Ukraine, because I represent Kyiv Mohyla Academy. Our students are really appreciating this work. Professor Yekelchyk is about to finish the new book about the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917-1921. We are also happy and honored to welcome at this round table and at this conference the professor from the United States of America, the professor from the Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, Professor Sanborn, and anyone researching Russian Empire and our region and Eastern Europe of the early 20th century would never ignore the legacy and the work, the fundamental works based on the archive materials by Professor Sanborn. It's a very interesting approach, the unparalleled, unique approach, I would say, because he studies varied phenomena, and of course some of the issues related to the military history, the military conscription, mobilization, the functioning of the empire. And it's not the narrow context of the war or the revolution, but he takes a much wider and broader context of 1905, 1925. These are 20 years, covering quite an extensive period, saturated with events. I encourage you to read his works as well if you haven't done this yet. These are some very interesting opinions about the collapse of the empires, in particular of the Russian Empire, and what was happening in the territory of Ukraine at that time. This is the book to read. And also next to me there is an incredible person, and those who are regular visitors of the Center for Urban History know her. This is Oksana Dudko, and she's instrumental to all of these events. She's the one who initiated this project for the research of the First World War through urban experiences here at the Center for Urban History. She has worked for quite a long time to design the interactive map of Lviv, and she also was the one to design and organize the exhibition about the Great War. It was so successful that it was extended from 2014 to 2016. We had the school pupils who were playing the game here on the computer. It was about the events of the First World War. It was also the way to engage children to study about this period of time. Oksana is working on a very unique topic, theaters during the First World War in Lviv. And this is the focus that really helps understand many other phenomena taking place in seemingly extreme everyday life conditions. Tonight we would like to discuss some topics related to our understanding and comprehending of urban experiences and how it could contribute to our understanding of this period post-1917. When we organized this conference, we assumed that this approach could be fruitful. Now we are at the round table to summarize the conference in a way. That is why I would like to pose a question to all participants. What they think about the possibilities and also about the restrictions of this approach, studying the urban experience and the events of 1917 and post through urban experience. Mr. Yekelchyk, I suggest you start.
Thank you very much, Olena, for your introduction. I now regret that I have not recorded it for posterity, for my colleagues. I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of you haven't missed much, it was an introductory joke. I'm going to talk a little bit about Eastern and Central European cities from a rather unusual angle. Or perhaps it is the angle which is very familiar to some of us, but not to most of us. And I thought I would start with the topic of Comrade Lenin and Comrade Stalin about the cities of Eastern and Central Europe. I'm sure all of you know that the Bolsheviks disbanded the Constituent Assembly. It's not common knowledge, however, that nearly 2 years later, after Lenin disbanded the Constituent Assembly, he looked very carefully at the election results. That was December 1919. The civil war was nearly over. He was confident of the Bolshevik victory. He went back to the election results to pore over them and discovered something important. One particular region stood out as the region in which the Bolsheviks really only established a foothold in the cities. That was Ukraine. Lenin's recommendation in December 1919, we should not ignore the national question. It is a mistake to ignore the national question. Let's keep in mind that the issue of the nation state is secondary, or perhaps even more than secondary. It is very far in the line of major issues. All kinds of compromises are possible in the issue of the nation state. If the Ukrainian comrades want to have their own nation state, I can easily imagine, Lenin says, the period of experimentation with their own state, or perhaps in federation with Russia, or perhaps in some other connection. But, of course, this issue is secondary or tertiary for Lenin precisely because the issue of political control over the structure is the most important one, the issue of party dictatorship and having joint military forces. Lenin does not enunciate here the nature of the problem. But the nature of the problem is actually the disconnect between the city and the countryside in that particular part of Eastern Europe and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. This disconnect should be called by its proper name, imperial legacy. It's the legacy of the empire, which is in the process of being undone, and the Bolsheviks now realize that they need to at least pretend that they are participating in this process of undoing imperial legacy. So Lenin, as I say, never really returns to the issue of what happens in Ukraine and why Ukrainian cities are separated from the countryside, but Stalin does, and repeatedly so. As probably some of you know, Stalin went to Vienna to write his early, most famous theoretical work on Marxism and the national question. He crossed the border illegally here in Galicia, without speaking any foreign languages. In the Polish side of Galicia, he apparently tried to order food in Russian and received really bad treatment from the Polish waiter. Stalin does bring up Galicia quite a few times, and even the eastern part. In fact, he speaks of Galicia as an example of a strong, fully mobilized national movement of Ukrainians, he doesn't say Ruthenians, but Ukrainians against the Poles. In another place, he actually specifies in kind of more rigid Marxist terms that this is the movement of Ukrainian rural bourgeoisie against the Polish urban bourgeoisie. He sounds really ambiguous. You may even decide that he is on the Ukrainian side here. Then, in other words, Stalin speaks repeatedly about other cities of the region. His favorite example is Riga, the capital of Latvia, which was brought up in our conference repeatedly. He keeps saying that 50 years ago, 40 years ago, for him, Riga was a fully German-speaking city. It is now Latvian, and other cities in the region are going to follow suit. He actually speaks about Hungarian cities without naming them. And on one occasion he says, you cannot go against history, quote unquote. So, in other words, he acknowledges that the Bolsheviks would have to join in the process of undoing imperial legacy. But there is a crucial qualification here. Stalin's definition of the nation does not include having your own state, or polity, or any identity, including borders. It's only the economic community, community of culture, he says, spirit, psychology, language, but not the state. At first I thought, well, that was a kind of proper Marxist approach. But then, of course, in the 1920s, some comrades asked Stalin to revise this definition, because they now want to argue that the nations of the Soviet Union are not really nations, because you have to have your own state. It seems easy to them, given the realities of Europe in the 1920s. And Stalin writes back a letter destroying completely their position, arguing that no, the new socialist type of nations, they do not require their own state. Now, the truth of the matter, of course, is that we find in numerous sources that Stalin and others see the national question as the peasant question. That's why the cities and the countryside, the peasant question in Ukraine is famously solved by Holodomor, the famine, the genocidal famine of the 1930s. This question in this particular region is solved by collectivization of the late 1940s and the destruction of Ukrainian national resistance. And then the process that Stalin wanted to present as following history, not going against history, actually never happens. The cities in the Soviet Union, the Belarusian, Ukrainian cities, they don't really become fully Ukrainian as such until the violence of World War II and the forced resettlements that Stalin organizes. So it's not then the organic process of kind of helping the nation develop, but it is an extremely violent Stalinist process. And this is the reason, by the way, why the cities in the region repeatedly, or perhaps even constantly, undergo this symbolic reimagination. That's why we talk so much about the streets and monuments. And this is actually the legacy of violence based on a very rigid understanding of history. But it does originate in an important pan-European global process of undoing imperial legacy, which the Bolsheviks tried to master and ended up applying in arms violence as a result.
Yeah, I mean, this question of whether we learn anything new from studying the urban history of this period. On the one hand, I'm tempted to say no at first, that we actually know quite a lot from seeing other processes that are going on in the countryside, at battlefronts, that very similar processes are taking place in a number of areas. But I think urban history does actually, so I'm giving both sides of the answer. I think it does because it concentrates in a way that historians can look at much more clearly some of these processes. And we talked a lot about the events in Lviv in November 1918, and I think that's a perfect example of a wide range of processes, political, military, ethnic, that get concentrated in a few days, and that we're able to take a look at to understand more broadly the region in the period. And the difficulty, though, is that I think sometimes we bring earlier categories, earlier urban categories, and expect them to hold in this period of tremendous, tremendous change. And I'll talk at some point, I think, about the way that I think we have to think about social history in a new way during the war, because pre-existing social groups are eroded and new social groups are created, and those happen in the cities as well. And so we have to be careful when thinking about the categories that we're using in these cities. What does it mean to be a worker if you are a refugee? What does it mean to adopt an ethnic identification if you come from a mixed family? We have to adopt new analytical tools, and I think many of the participants in the program were doing so, and some of the most promising ones, I thought, had to do with gender, actually. I mean, we know that gender isn't just talking about women, right? That's not what gender history is. It's not just adding women. It's a way of thinking about history. It's a way about thinking about the power relationships between different parts of society in a much different way. You know, Mariana's paper had new sources, it had new methodologies, it had new ways of thinking about what it might mean to live in a fortress like Przemysl or to live in Lviv during the years of the war. And not just for women, but how do you conceptualize this new space? How do you conceptualize this new social experience? And I think this provides new models for doing so. And I also think it provides new models for doing so when it relates to men. We had occasion on several points during the conference to talk about the rise of irregular militaries, paramilitary groups, whether those are city militias, whether those are ethnic militias, Jewish militias, Ukrainian, Polish militias, Estonian, whether they are just bands of deserters. You have a whole set of irregular forces that have a legacy, in many cases, of military service, but who are recreating what it means to act as a man in the world, and often in quite destructive ways. The sorts of masculinities that get developed over the course of the war are enormously destructive, and I think unless we think about the ways that these masculine codes and these masculine behaviors are occurring, we're not getting the full experience of the war. And then finally, on yet another level, I think, if we think about gender, if we think about the building of new nations, these require new gender orders. Stephanie was talking earlier today about nations trying to create purity, trying to create cleanliness, right? And similar things happen in terms of masculine and feminine orders. And so in this creation of this new era, of these new states, of these new nations, paying close attention to the way that these things unfold within urban spaces is, I think, enormously important, and allows us then to study, to look at new places in the city, to look at new kinds of events in the city, and find out what these new urban histories might look like.
Thank you. And first thing to say is that the primary purpose of my remarks are to Europeanize the discussion in the full sense of the term. That is to say, this is not a separate part of the history of the First World War. It's right in the middle. And it's right in the middle of the upheaval that the First World War brought all over the world. It's a global problem. The question is how to do that, because all too often the history of the First World War has been split into one either revolving around the Russian Revolution and the new nations that were created, or revolved around the German question and the way in which Britain and France tried to cripple the war-making capacity of Germany after losing the war. And I'd like to suggest that we go beyond both of them and try to write to use urban history to show what not only a European history of the war would look like, but what a global history of the war would look like. Because the war involved population movements of such a gigantic scale from all over the world, that we are talking about cities as places where population change is radicalized in many different respects, this one being included. If I'm right, then I'm very happy to act as an advisor to give the benefit of 20 years and more of experience on urban history in the First World War. And the first thing is, the key issue is identifying the archives that are available in different urban centers. There's a lot more out there than people realize, and we've seen the results of research from very different contributors. They need to be preserved, digitized whenever possible to make them available. Your material on Paris registers, I was very jealous, I have to say, of what was available online, and the information about these people who died was something that I've never seen before anywhere else. So there's no assurance that the archival richness of let's say, Kyiv, it will dwarf the archives that are available in some of the Western European cities. So I want to put to you a proposal. The proposal is that what you ought to do is to aim at a publication. And my experience over a long time is publications in journals fade, publications in books remain more accessible. They remain accessible the way my students have always done it. They go into a library, they're looking for something else, and they come across the title. by accident. And if that is the case, what kind of a book should it be that could take the potential that we've seen over the last 2 days? And I think it should be a collective work in the sense that the subject is so big that no one individual can do it. So I want to present an idea of a 3-year project that needs funding and that justifies it and is entirely within the European research agenda for the next 10 years. I'm on several of their committees, so I know what they don't want. They want this. They want this kind of work. And it would be a 3-year project in which a series of groups of 3 young scholars, hopefully, not necessarily young scholars, but young ones, I think, are the ones we want to set in motion, who would focus on different facets of urban life in 3 different cities where archives exist and are comparable. And they would do national studies. I made a list of them. This is the 2nd volume of Paris, London, Berlin. This was taken from Michel de Certeau, from his book on the politics of everyday life, a walking tour of the cities. How do people use them? Where do their feet go? By the way, poignantly, Michel de Certeau was a Jesuit priest who wound up to be one of the most influential, I think, cultural historians anywhere, said he thought this idea up when he was standing on the World Trade Center, which is no longer there. And he looked down and said, how do New Yorkers use the city? Where do they go? So we had a chapter on the station. How do people enter and how do people leave? One on cafe culture. One on markets. One on public squares and their control. One on theaters and concerts. One on churches. One on schools. One on universities. One on hospitals and one exit. One on cemeteries. Each of the chapters were originally written by 3 people in 3 different cities. One chapter, let's just say, on churches in one city, in Paris, one in another, London, another in Berlin. But we could easily see that the choice of 3 cities could vary in chapter. They don't have to be the same. This is not a replication of what we did before, but a way of getting scholars to work with others, and therefore to avoid what I think to be the death of scholarship, which is isolation, being separate and lonely. Because the job market is so terrible, isolation is almost inevitably part of the training of scholars. This is a way of reducing it. That would be year 1, having a series of groups of 3 who are writing national papers, national in the sense of a city within a different national unit. And the 2nd year is where those 3 people, after they write their national histories, get together and write together a collective essay on hospitals in East Central European cities in the course of the First World War, or churches, or markets, or cafes. I mean, we could vary the subjects, it wouldn't really matter. And writing together is something, after all, that scientists have learned years ago, and there's no problem about it, but our profession is still, I think, stuck in the 18th century, where the individual authorial voice, a la Voltaire, is the only thing that mattered. But they had the encyclopédie also in the 18th century. So what I'm asking for is the recognition that collective authorship is actually the future. It's the future for a number of other reasons, too. But if I'm right, there's a 2nd year in which groups of people can work together to create a collective piece of work about a particular subject. Then the 3rd year is putting that together with a whole range of other collective works in the collective history of East Central European cities and urban life. And it's a bold project, and it hurts, it's hard, it's expensive, but it is, I think, the model of future work on the European level, which is, I know what the European Science Foundation wants to support, and this is the kind of thing that they would love to have. Now, if that is the case, then the first stage is identifying the students whom you are teaching, whom you can speak to about a future, about the possibility, and again, a collective future, a future with other students, with other young people, to move forward. And I think in some respects, the concept of having the urban level as a dimension of the history of war is both inevitable and actually new. Here I think would be on the new side, because the national histories of war have been written, the transnational histories of war haven't been written. They are to be written, and urban life is one of those that needs to be written, and I think we'll have not only a market, but we'll have a readership. Now, the last thing I want to suggest is this, that this relates also to your digital project. The longer I've been in this business, the more I realize that the critical change in the history of well, what happened in the First World that was really revolutionary was that family history crossed world history, and they never separated since. And that's because of the scale of the war and mobilization and conscription and all kinds of things. The more you can do family history, you use sources based upon family history, the more I think you draw people to the project. Most of those who work, I could tell you more about this, in the National Archives in Paris are doing genealogies. They're doing their family histories. Because this is what counts. This is what really matters. And I think it counts. And for heaven's sakes, I'm not opposed to what they're doing in the slightest. Now, family histories involve movement and disruption, destruction, reconsideration. Where do people learn about gender? They learn about it at their mother's knee. That's where they learn about it, and their father's knee too. And sometimes they learn things that are dreadful and are very hard to escape from. But if families are the places where socialization and acculturation happens, where you learn who you are. After all, none of us knows who we are until our family tells us what it is. So, how to make this the urban history, the history of urban families, is the primary theme I'd like to suggest to you as the sum of these sites, because families are what people live in, even when they're broken. One theme, for instance, I tried to figure out a way to get it in, and I couldn't in any of the discussions. Maybe it's because of the fact that I'm 73 years old. But one of the groups that suffered most in the First World War everywhere are the elderly. And part of the reason is inflation destroys charitable resources, wipes them out, because they're almost always in savings or in small funds. And then inflation, 100% in 2 years. The elderly, after all, the people who really help the elderly to this day are other elderly people. And what happens to them? Most of them that I've studied in the past go back to farming, because the main farmer is in the army, or he's dead, or he's crippled. So people who think they've, had a lifetime of back-breaking labor from 4 a.m. in the morning go back to back-breaking labor at 4 in the morning. There are groups of people who suffer within families that we haven't noticed. They just don't come up in most of the issues, except they exist in all of our lives. All of us have these generational transfers that happen in times of crisis and emergency, and only when we can make family sources and family resources, which are, I think, more and more and more available, can we do that. Now, the final point goes back to the beginnings, archives. One of the most astonishing things that has happened, and I wonder how it would work here, one of the most astonishing things that's happened in the First World War business is called the La Grande Collecte. What happened in Paris, it happened in London too, it's happening in the United States, to my great surprise, is that the main institutions, the National Library, the National Archives, puts ads in the newspaper and said, anybody, do you have a suitcase in your attic that belonged to Great Uncle Henry, and you don't know what to do with it, and somebody gave it to you and nobody was interested in it? We will take it. It will be part of the National Archive. We will therefore democratize the archive. It won't only be the good and the great. It will be anybody. Well, in the French case alone, between 1914 and now, there have been 60,000 new archives that are family archives that have come into the collection. By the way, terrifying the poor archivists who have to now do the inventories and all that. But think about that for a moment. In the case, this has happened in England, as it always happens, on the local level, that is to say, it's not nationally done quite the same way, but local record offices, Oxford is one of the ones, maybe Warwick has done it too. This is a very fine labor history archive at the University of Warwick. There are ways of appealing to people to bring what they've got and what they've collected, and it doesn't have to be only about the First World War, of course not, but to bring family history collections to national archives has produced a deluge. And I mean all over the world. I've seen this in Australia and New Zealand, but that's because for them the Great War is the moment of their national birth. But that's not so different, you know, when it comes down to it. The concept of creating a national narrative where this is, as it were, year 0 or year 1 is what we've been talking about as well. So my claim is that family history is really our friend and our future. And it's, of course, it's been that way. It's been our past all along. And the more that you can plug into, call them national projects in Ukraine in general, or if you will, in Poland or wherever it would happen to be, the more you can see it as the patrimoine, the patrimony of the nation's cultural heritage, the more I think you'll get the kinds of archives that you want. So if you will, one of the ways of applying for money, and substantial sums of money, is to merge these two issues of urban history and family history as sites of the collection of the archives of the nation's memory, the nation's heritage, as it will. You know, all kinds of words that are used necessarily in applications for grants. We all know that there's a language you have to develop. But there's a very good reason for it. It is that these cities are militarized and they're feminized. In other words, a lot of men are somewhere else, and that too raises issues of, shall we say, the distribution of the family income and alcohol consumption and so on, that are inevitably based upon how families were organized and how they have to find a way to keep on going in the future. So I'm prepared, as now a happily retired gentleman, to help out, and I mean this materially, not just because I produced books in the past, that's probably not that important, but to provide support for your future, which I admire. I think this is a wonderful place, and you know, it took guts to put it together, and as indeed this conference took time, effort, and money to put together too, for which I'm very grateful. But this must be, this must lead to publication. I'm insistent, I've always been insistent with all of my graduate students, the same thing, that what you do is to exchange in print the fruits of your labor. And it's the way to get ahead in whatever part of the profession or whatever part of your life. Half of the 102 students whom I supervised all the way through to the PhD in my childbearing years, as they say, are in business of one kind or another, banking, commerce and trade. And why? Because historians learn how to take an enormous amount of material and reduce it to a small area and then help make investment decisions. So can I suggest that you have here in the embryo a very important project on the urban history of war and peace in Central and Eastern Europe that nobody's ever done before. And I find it exciting. I found these 2 days, not just that I've learned a lot. And my God, I was very happy, you know, imagine my giving that lecture, listening in front of all of you experts, because I'm not a historian of the East, but I've been trying to educate myself for a long time. And this, I can tell you, this group here has a real opportunity, a golden opportunity to create something that will benefit the young, and also, I think, establish a way of not falling for the nationalist interpretations of history, because urban life is to a degree smaller and to a degree larger than that. People move in all kinds of directions using all kinds of strategies. So the final statement I wanted to make was that collective history is the future. We all have to write individual history, but there is a real problem. The problem is that the jobs that were available to our generation are not going to be there in the future. And the best way for young people to really get their professional qualifications is to write together and to work together. As you've set up an institute to do it, now's the time to benefit from your foresight, and I think to do it in a way that will make not the publication of this meeting not a journal article, which I'm not against, I've written my share, but will be in a form of a book that can be available to people all over the world. I would be delighted to help out in any way. I'm sure other people feel the same. Consider this is a standing offer. It's something for the future. It's something that university presses can accommodate. I run a series in one of them. I know this is the right thing, the right kind of thing for us. The door is open. You don't have to knock. All you have to do is to have the time and the energy to put a group of young people together. And I think you have a wonderful opportunity right in front of you.
Thank you very much for this very offer, and it's just, you know, it's already a great result of all our efforts, I think. But Oksana, I would like to ask you, what would you say? Whether we reach actually
Good evening to everyone. After the words of Professor Winter, I feel like rushing and writing the project application, you know, for the grant. But I would like to mention some things, but I would like to take a broader perspective, not a narrow Ukrainian perspective, or the projects that we were implementing at the Center for Urban History. I would also like to briefly talk about archives, but in a different way, from Professor Winter's perspective. I believe that all of us here, I mean Ukrainian historians or some of them, are concerned about the issue of the narrow national narratives that never overlap. I think a city could be the entry point to start talking about the narrow nationalist narratives and to reconsider them. Why would I mention the archive? Because I believe the city as such, as a physical and symbolic space, could be a very good archive in itself. Because we all love the national history, not only because we are the nationalists or the patriots, but also because the willingness to create the national narratives really left behind a lot of archives, and it's easy to work with them. And this is the huge corpus of the documents, and this is the easiest way to write the history. You just take the ready archive and reconsider it and rethink it. Of course, you can reread it and read it against the stream, but I think city as such could be another alternative archive to study urban history. Since I was dealing with theater for some time, I would like to give the example of Lviv and theater. This morning, when I was doing the presentation, I followed the stream because I really showed the theaters, national theaters that existed either physically or symbolically, Polish theater, Jewish theater, etc. But there are many more materials to study these theaters. But if we take a look at the First World War and what was happening before the war and during the First World War, then it's very interesting to take a look on the outside on the national theaters. When we take a look on the physical space, it turns out that beyond these national theaters, there were dozens of theater companies, of actors who had their audiences, and these audiences were really inter-ethnic, multi-ethnic, and they were performing in different languages, and the audiences at these performances were much bigger than in the national theaters. Another thing I would like to mention well, cities, revolutionary cities as such, also were mentioned a lot in different writings, but little has been written about the relation between the cities during the war and during the revolutions, which practices were used and had an impact on the revolutionary events in the cities. But getting back to the theater, I think Ukrainian territory and Ukrainian cities are also interesting because they were the sites of interaction, they were locations of interactions, they were open structures, they were not closed structures. When I started researching the Ukrainian theater of Ruska Beseda and tried to understand what was happening to these people during the war, I realized they were everywhere. In the morning, in my presentation, I mentioned the theater from Ternopil Theatrical Nights, and it really had a very short history from 1915 to 1917, and this theater was also the survival strategy for the actors because they were playing the popular performances. But on the other hand, this was the first fixed, permanent theater in the city. Why would I mention this example? Because the cities that were not so important due to the front lines or movement of the troops, they actually acquired a very big status, and the events that were taking place in the course of the war, they gave impetus to the development of new cultural practices after the war, and I think it's very important to consider. And talking about the theatrical personalities that I studied, and it was mentioned in the presentations today, the fact that the mobility, typical for the First World War, resulted in the interaction between the city and the rural areas. And I would like to mention the Ruska Beseda theater, because it was the theater to perform in front of the urban audiences, the same as many other theater. But during the war, this theater was performing for the rural audiences a lot. So the notions of the cultural practices originally designed for the cities, they transformed and changed during the war and during the revolutions. So on the one hand, the cities are not able to give answers to all of the questions that we posed during the conference, but I think that in the context of the region under our focus, they could give many more new perspectives and opportunities to take a different new look on the same events. And the last thing to say, I think the point is in the details. We know a lot about the events happening here in the political or military aspect, but I think details do matter. And it's not only about the physical practices and experiencing the war and surviving the war and experiencing the revolutionary events that were taking here from 1914 to 1923-24 could be researched and studied through the cities. Thank you, Oksana, and thank you for this first pool of answers to my first question. Actually, since I represent the Department of History of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and it's really well known for the specific approach that history should be human-centered. There should be humans in history, and I'm also really supporting this approach. And I think urban experience as such in this respect is good to help us plug into the society. This is what Professor Winter was talking about combining this family history. The families should emerge here, because urban history is about this social fabric combined with the, social fabric of the city could be explained within the environment, within the space, and the space could be explained through this social fabric. There is no other way to understand the city. This is social topography, this is social geography, even social physiognomics for the city. We often talk about this, otherwise we cannot explain this properly. So the approach is also good because you need to put yourself into the shoes of this city resident and put your feet in the streets that he was walking along. That is why I think writing urban history is very difficult to do because of that, primarily. Maybe the methodology is not very well mastered in Ukraine, let's be frank. We do not have the urban history good enough here, and this conference and the previous workshop also had an objective to change and to show that researching the period of war and revolutions shall be related to our approaches. We cannot really disintegrate the research of the revolution and of the First World War. And through the cities, we might take a different look on these events, because this way or the other, the fate of revolution was determined in the cities. It might be debatable how this was happening, but cities are becoming important. Of course, villages are important for our modern world, and cities are because our modern world is urbanized. We could really debate a lot about global cities and so on, but of course, if we compare the GDP of New York and Ukraine, then it could be illustrative. So we have very different networks in the modern world, and of course cities are getting increasingly important, and I think this focus on the city could help us understand our present world. But getting back to the period under discussion, I would like to ask another question to the participants. What do you think? How could we, well, could we say that the processes that we observe in the cities of this period of time, after 1917, is about huge violence and otherness, and we can see new categories of hatred and new categories of enemies. This is the issue of informing on the others. There are so many negative things in the social violence that we study and we observe. Could we speak? Could we say that the study of this period could help us understand what was happening in this part of the Europe of the world later in the 30s? So this is the question: what else? What else could we squeeze out of these cities and these processes? Or maybe on the other hand, it's the exaggeration, because every age, every period of time has certain preconditions, and maybe we shouldn't be trying to find the explanations of the attitudes to terror in Russia in the 30s with the roots in the Civil War. But when we talk about the birth of the new world and of the new Europe that is emerging in this part of the world in 1917, determined by the revolution, when we talk about the Western Europe, it's the end of the 18th. Yesterday, Professor was very good to show about the other periodization, about the Second Great War. But in any way, the new world is being created. So this is my question to all of the participants of the round table.
Thank you, Olena, for mapping out a research agenda, really, for the studies of the period that came after the official end of World War I, at least on the Western Front, because as we know, violence continued, in fact, in great many other parts of Europe, including the parts that would normally, in geopolitical mapping, belong to the West, Ireland, most notably. But the process itself was indeed anchored in the cities. And the city happens to be a very interesting background study for the revolution and the violence. Cities are taken, right? Taken sometimes by a combination of military force and rebellion in the city itself. In the process, and I think the point was made already at this conference by a few people, including myself in the comments once, is that some of the cities did not experience the change of power during the war itself. They were never taken by the German army. They didn't see the violence, so the very first experience of violence actually happened as a result of the conflict developing out of this imperial collapse. I think the language and the practices formed in the process were influenced mightily by the practices of World War I. In particular, the language of German barbarity, the rape of Belgium. It is so prominent in Western imagination of what World War brings to a society, to civilians. We can trace them very easily. And it was done by Professor Mick on the example of Lviv, when the Polish and Ukrainian soldiers start taking smoking breaks and taking picture-taking breaks, photographed together in the intervals in between fighting. But then the barbarity comes into play. Then the mutilated bodies show up, and then it's no longer possible. A different language. And what I find interesting, of course, that Lviv did change hands quite a few times, right? But it's actually the soldiers of the same army, which is a situation complicated in more than one way. But of course, in Kyiv, we experience exact same story, as Olena described in her wonderful presentation on Kyiv. The construction of the concept of a martyrdom is happening in early 1919. Actually, January 1919 is when the construction of martyrdom is happening on various fronts. Both the Russian monarchists, the whites, and the Ukrainian side want to bury the victims of the Bolshevik, or of the first Bolshevik taken on the city. Of course, the Bolsheviks, once they took the city, the first thing they do, they bury the victims of the rebellion in the arsenal factory, which becomes a colossal part of Bolshevik mythology. And then its competition of martyrdoms constructs a reality in which it's no longer possible to continue negotiations, even though negotiations are in fact ongoing between the Ukrainian and the Bolshevik side, but there is already blood between them, and it's becoming impossible. Hrushevsky, a historian himself, but now also the head of the revolutionary parliament, puts it in a very nice words. He says, that was what made it impossible for us to remain in the same state with Russia. That finally broke this link, this thinking about federation, the United Socialist Front. He means the victims, but I mean something else. The martyrdom, right? The concept of martyrdom, which is developed on all sides, the victims in the name of the nation, they're constructed in a certain way. Of course, Hrushevsky's own property, as Olena showed beautifully in her presentation, becomes one of the symbols, which I think is a very interesting and misleading symbol in some way, because it's investment property, it's a rental, right? His own house actually survives, and there is a museum right there, so he invested a lot of money into this rental building, and the evil Bolsheviks destroyed it, right? But Hrushevsky is the one who initiates, of course, the creation of the mythology of Krute, right? He is not using the term. Just last week I was reading the protocols of Central Rada, the originals, and the term is not yet in use. He says the people who died at Bakhmut, which is of course the main railway hub to which they headed, but then decided not to stay there because it was politically unreliable, and actually tried to defend a smaller station. But the name Krute really comes into use already as a result of this funeral, after the funeral, as a result of speeches. And it's constructed in a certain way too, because they are children. They are constructed as children of the nation. That's why it is important that they are civilians, even so, as we now know, the majority of Ukrainian fighters at Krute were in fact military cadets and the local militia, the Free Cossacks, right? But it is the sacrifice of young students, civilians, that is remembered, and for a good reason, because this is World War I and a longer history of describing barbarity and crime, and national discord taught us this way. So cities then become also a place of victimhood. Krute is a small railway station these days, reproduced in great many films, paintings, but it is in Kyiv that they become martyrs, because the colossal state funeral is arranged by the Ukrainian government as soon as they are back in Kyiv. And of course the question of the graves gives trouble to historians ever since.
Yeah, so this question of how, if at all, the urban experiences of World War I helped lead us towards the dark years of the 30s and into the 40s is one, obviously, that is asked constantly and deserves to be asked. And I guess I would take a slightly different approach. I'm not certain that violence is a direct function of hatred or othering. There's a long literature that suggests it is, that one often hears, oh, you have to build hatred before you can imagine atrocity. I don't actually think that's true. Actually, I think violent soldiers, violent men, they will have a smoke break before they start shooting at other people. The patterns of violence, I think they transcend these affective dispositions that we have, these emotions that we have. Now, they build into them, and I think, the notion that at a certain point peace becomes impossible because too much sacrifice has been made, that's obviously an emotional state, and I think it's an important one. But I think more important because I do think what happens in World War I and then through these years of civil war, I think these do lay the groundwork for the 30s and for the 40s, and in maybe two specific ways. The first was the destruction of states. For me, states are very, very important. They not only do things like regulate an economy, provide welfare services, try to ensure food supply, but they also ensure security in their best days, and they we've talked about this a lot, legitimate authority. And so when those states disappear, as all of the great empires, pre-war empires do, you're going to have a vacuum. It is the job of nationalist historiography to pretend that this is seamless, to pretend that the empires die and the nation starts the next day. But that isn't actually how it happens, and we can see that in urban histories, but also in rural histories. We can see how that process of state building is in fact a very tense one, a very conflicted one, and often quite a violent one. And what gets mapped onto this, as I suggested before, is I think, new social circumstances that demand a new social history. Let me just mention a few social groups that either did not exist in 1913 or were very small and were much more significant by the time you get to 1919, 1920. Refugees, most obviously, millions and millions. Invalidi, right? So all the war wounded. Again, counting in the millions. Nurses. Now, of course, they existed before the war, but they existed much larger numbers afterwards. Soldiers' wives, soldiers' widows. Also a new social group that is very important during the war. And then, although this group is not new, I think they take on a new role and a new importance given the economic conditions of the war. And these are market women. Yaroslav in his paper was talking some about these bread riots, which occur all over the Russian Empire because of food supply problems. And it is quite often the case that the people in the market being attacked are women, and also that the people leading those attacks are women. You have these new forms of violence and these new social patterns. At the same time, the traditional social groups that we've mapped onto these, right? Peasants, workers, intelligentsia, all of these have been fundamentally eroded and in some cases completely undermined by the war. I mentioned earlier today, what does it mean to be a peasant after nearly all of you have gone off to war? Are you the same peasant you were 2 years ago? Can we really say you have the same habits, you have the same stereotypes that you might place on them because of all we know about the peasant, the Ukrainian peasant, the Russian peasant, whatever? Can we still call them the same group? And of course, workers. I mean, what does it mean to be a worker in 1913 as opposed to 1919 after the Great Russian Revolution, right? It's a different social group with different expectations and different behaviors. And so we have unstable states, and we have very unstable societies that are each trying to find their way in the 20s and 30s. And this lends itself to a pervasive sense of disorder, even in places where, or most places, I guess Estonia excluded, was showing how Estonia was excluded from a lot of this, where this sense of instability is really overwhelming, and the search for stability becomes profound. Which is, I think, why we get dictatorships all over the region soon after the war, right? A lot of right-wing military dictatorships, but then, the Bolsheviks too, a left-wing military dictatorship. So dictatorship comes to this region quite early. And then this leads to ever more violent processes of state governance that, again, are not just present in fascist states. They're present in, sort of embedded in these nascent states and societies. And so when the great fascist moment comes in the 30s and then the anti-fascist response to it, you have similarly unstable societies prone to violence and prepped for this large war. Now that will end up being part of, obviously, hatred and atrocity. But I think they're rooted in these other things, and the hatred and atrocity are secondary too.
I think there's an interesting contrast just before, make just three simple points. An interesting contrast. Nobody in Western Europe is innocent of brutality and atrocity because of the way empires run affairs in Africa and Asia. Nothing that the Germans did in Belgium matches what the Belgians did in the Congo. Nothing. So the concept of the chickens coming home to roost is a Western European phenomenon. And, you know, the massacre at Amritsar in 1919 is a continuation of earlier atrocity, brutality, violence of a racial kind in India and well, the Middle East. I won't go there for the moment. No need to do it. But there's a very important point that the concept of atrocity and violence is not born in war. It's born more in empire than in war. The Boxer Rebellion. 1 million Chinese destroyed, killed, mutilated, decapitated, whatever. This was a pan-European event, yes, led by the Kaiser, to be sure, but he was not by no means alone. So the issue of the origins of atrocity it cannot be the First World War when we know about the nature of imperial cruelty. You just read Joseph Conrad, and I think we can find about that. Now, there are three things that I do think the First World War did to make the 30s probable. The first is, it's William Butler Yeats, destroyed, the center doesn't hold, destroying liberalism. You know, the middle ground is a casualty of war in almost every single country that I know something about, and probably quite a few countries I know very little about. It'd be interesting to see to what extent, even in Estonia, there might be a radicalization, although my hope is that Estonia is the exception. No, all right, even Estonia. So the first point is that the center doesn't hold, the liberal center doesn't hold. The second is that the peace settlement ignored the fundamental truth that political stability only comes with economic stability. And the way in which the peace treaty was organized was massively irrational. Partly because of the identification of Germany as the only power that was responsible for the war and therefore the reparations. Just look what happens after 1945 and you'll see they got the point that you cannot create a stable political order in Europe anywhere without a stable economic order. It just can't be done. And I think the collapse of the Soviet Union is another example of that. So the second point is that the peace was a disaster. And that, too, led to all kinds of support for revising it, for changing it, for appeasement, for so on. The third thing that the First World War did made what happened in the 30s and 40s possible is the racialization of national conflicts. It is true that the concept of German atrocities had an element of propaganda which made their Germanness behind the Schrecklichkeit that they unleashed. And of course, this is not new. It was there before, God knows. But what the First World War did was to racialize the enemy and then immediately have that racialization attached to whatever internal enemy. That's why I wanted to make the claim that there was a Second Great War, because civil war takes the categories of national war and makes them worse. And because it's the neighbor, it's the person down the street, it's the Jews with their militia here in Lviv and elsewhere. So that racialization is fundamental. But I think the problem as well that is direct, I think I go further than you on this, Joshua. What happened in the First World War was state-legitimated assembly line killing. The experience of mass death happened because states legitimated it. If it could be done once, it could be done again. And in the aftermath of the war, just to give you one measure of it, states were much bigger in terms of their economic life than they had ever been before. The proportion of gross national product in every single state goes up because states do things after the war that they didn't do before, and there are all the pensions to pay for, and all of the wounded and so on. So my claim is that the state under Stalin became a monster, but that the state itself grew to a point where he could turn it into monstrous purposes is a function of what economic historians call a threshold effect. That once you go past, once state expenditure goes up to a certain point, you don't go back to status quo ante bellum, and there's a concentration effect. That's the other way economic historians talk about it, that central states have powers that previously were more diffused in the previous period. So for all of these reasons, I think the First World War was a complete catastrophe for the whole of the 20th century. And it set the ground for the repetition of as it were, the racialization of hatred. It didn't necessarily ensure that it would happen, but I believe there is something in the imaginary which changed. I said that last night, that I don't think without the enormous casualties of the First World War, without Verdun, the Somme, and the others, including the bloodshed on the Eastern Front, not far from here. I helped publish a journal of an Austrian doctor who served in Brody, just north. And the bloodshed, in particular, I might add, in 1916. My view is both Russia and Austria-Hungary destroyed themselves in the Eastern Front, in the Brusilov offensive, which both was impressive, and then the aftermath of it was they were exhausted. And the Austrians, in resisting this, also found that they couldn't really organize their war effort in any way effectively thereafter. So my claim is that the First World War made possible the idea of state-legitimated mass killing. And that doesn't just mean in the national sense, it means in the racial sense. I don't believe that Auschwitz was thinkable before the First World War, which created an imaginary in which state-legitimated mass death was accepted by millions of people because they believed in the war effort until roughly 1917, when everything began to come apart. The final point about the links are personal. And here I go back to family issues. How many of the people who were leaders in the Second World War were in the First World War? And in the First World War, in places where they go back to again, the same issue of how many in the German army in the First World War actually, they were on the Eastern Front before. They had their colonial projects and so on. In Western Europe, we know this is true, but Orlando Figes years ago showed how many of the old imperialist officers joined the new game in town and stayed. So when you realize that Tukhachevsky was a prisoner of war in 1916, and so was Charles de Gaulle. Not far away, the general, the major British generals were there. I needn't go into that, but the Second World War is the continuation of the biographies of very substantial middle rank officers, as well as the Trumans and the Churchills and so on. They're there, and the memory of the First World War, of course, informs the notion of how to go about victory. And this time, you've got to destroy the enemy in order to win, because in 1918 it didn't happen. And you think of the Nazis. The Nazis took the lesson of 1918 exactly upside down. They weren't going to have a surrender in 1918, again in 1945. And that's the only reason that I can understand why certain groups, my wife's father lost his brother. It wasn't her uncle because he wasn't born yet, but he was killed by a group of very determined German soldiers in Alsace in April 1945. In April 1945? They're still fighting in Alsace. What for? The answer is so 1918 won't happen again. That the honor of the German army will finally be stripped of that terrible shame of 1918. There may be other reasons, but they're fighting the French. They're fighting teenagers who join up to liberate the honor of and they're excellent troops fighting excellent defensive warfare the way the German army frequently did. So it's, in my view, the Second World War is not part of the 30 Years' War, but nothing that we see in the Second World War, I believe, is free from the contamination of the whole range of institutional change and personal experiences about what human nature is capable of. And maybe some things that some of us don't even believe now that was still the truth. I admit that this is going to be a problem in terms of the movement of the historiography of the First World War to the East, because in my view of it, it was a total catastrophe. And celebrating anybody's national independence is in some ways dancing on a graveyard. Now that's not going to be, you won't sell that to many people who want to, in Poland I've seen this much more explicitly when I've lectured in Warsaw. And the new, there will be a museum now of the First World War, and I try to tell them, the word celebrate isn't the right one. There's something wrong with it. As I said yesterday, it has a taste as a fascist to it. But there are people who believe it. And I think we're in the truth business. We have to speak for what we believe. In my view, the First World War was the worst abomination human nature had put together. The Second World War was worse. But to see either of them as productive, even of martyrs, in my view, is a great mistake. Turn it off. Mike? Is this on? Oops.
I would like to mention one brief aspect. It's about the war creating very many divisions and divides. We were mentioning national divides mostly, but war actually generates many more divides. I would like to get back to the words of Professor Sanborn about the gender divisions and different divisions that were created during the war had a direct impact on the post-war period, such as the divisions between the men who were in the war and the men who were not in the war. This is also a very important aspect to mention, and I think many sources can be found that study the history of cities and also the new roles that women acquired during the war, how they impacted their post-war patterns. We also talked a lot about the brutalization of young people and their engagement in violent practices. It's also very important to understand how this identified their behavioral patterns in the post-war period, so we can draw many parallels like this. But the study of gender history in this region is very promising. Thank you to Oksana. And it's time to open the discussion. I encourage the audience to ask questions and to raise some remarks or comments. We have about 10 minutes to listen to questions, if any. Try to be brief. It will be very brief. I think we should have focused more on stopping the war. The historians study the war. We need to find a formula of a kind to stop the war. Look here, the First World War, this was the first global crisis. The Second World War was the second global crisis. Currently, we are having the third global crisis. The elements of the third global crisis are the floods, the droughts, the earthquakes, the car crashes. All of this are the elements of the third global crisis. If the world doesn't consolidate, it's not going to survive it. Because all of the situations, all of these elements, they will be increasing with time. So my question to you is, how do we redirect this consequential things into the better way. Well, we have grown on this planet. Maybe it's time to stop the wars. Thank you for your comment. Well, what we wanted to highlight with our conference as well, when we talk about the completion of the war never stops at one moment when, you know, the peace treaty is signed, etc. We wanted to show that there are multiple exits, and it's very unique for every city. So we are discussing certain processes that could not be the same for all cities. There are some similarities, we could compare them, but there are also individual experience. And these exits from the war could be really multiple, through the civil war, or through the revolution, or through the peaceful reintegration, or transfer of power, or restructuring, etc. We mentioned that some cities never changed the authorities, etc. We also were talking that today we are also in the state of war. We have no idea what the exit would be. We can see the processes are very complicated. But since there are no more questions, and we are getting to the end of this conference, I would like to take this opportunity and say thank you to everyone, to our participants of the discussion, and also to Oksana for her inspiration. I gave my answer to you. Maybe the other participants could add, okay? But I would also like to thank to all of the participants of the conference. We realized already that we are in for a large-scale publishing project, as suggested. I would like to congratulate all of you for the successful conference. We shall continue working on our publications because this is important indeed. We need to have this turn in the historiography, in particular in studying this period of time, both for Ukrainian historiography and for Ukrainian historians. It was very important to start overcoming and bridging this gap between the historiography, to overcome this asymmetry with our research. That's why we do realize that through publications and through such conferences it could be possible, and we could get there faster, but the general solution could be, and the general conclusion of the conference could be termed in the academic terms.
Time, but history also takes place. So this place is always important. And where is the place, there are people, and probably we have very nice approach how to show those people, how to reflect their experience. And it was actually how to probably make this our history more understandable to general population, to ordinary people. Actually, also think involving them into those studies, especially through those family studies. I think there is also our future. So thank you very much to all of you. Thanks.
Allow me to say thank you to the staff of the Center for Urban History, to Oksana, Mariana and Yulia for the great organizational details, because we really enjoyed the academic discussions. Thank you.